Look, if I'm honest about how I spent most of my career in e-commerce and how I see most of the teams I work with spending their time, it's usually on the rational stuff. We're really good at that. The product page, the checkout flow, the abandoned cart sequence, the discount thresholds, the free shipping triggers, all of it is pointed at the moment that someone is already really close to buying and trying to extract a little bit more conversion out of what's already there. We spend a lot of time there. And that work is important. But what I've come to believe in this role is only reinforced by the conversations in this show. We significantly underinvest in the thing that moves people the most, emotion. Not because we don't know it matters. I think most of us do. But because it's harder to measure, it's harder to brief, and harder to justify in a weekly performance review than a new checkout flow or a smarter abandoned cart sequence. So it keeps getting deprioritized in favor of the thing that shows up cleanly in a dashboard. That stuff makes rational sense. But the reality is that buying decisions are emotional more often than we'd like to admit. The rational stuff, the features, the specs, the pricing comparison, that all comes after. It's how we justify what we've already decided to do. And the brands that understand that and they build for it are playing a totally different game to the ones that are trying to convince people with free shipping thresholds and product benefit bullets. Nick Gray spent a decade at Nike and Adidas doing one thing, making consumers want things before they knew that they needed them. They were tastemakers first, early adopters next, general market last. Not because it's a clever sequencing trick, but because desire travels in that direction and you can't reverse engineer it. He now works with brands across retail and e-commerce, helping them figure out the emotional foundation that everything else needs to be built upon. Let's get into it.
After 10 years at Nike, it was kind of the reason why it was time for me to go. And it was simply because they were taking back those global directives and saying, right, here's the objective, go and implement it into the marketplace, as opposed to saying, here's what we need to achieve, you go and influence that. And so it did feel like you lost a bit of that. I don't know if control is the right word, but that ability to shape and shift and decide, what were the right stores, what were the right locations, who are the consumers that we're speaking to in order to deliver those objectives. And fundamentally, my objective, my job at Adidas and Nike was to make sure consumers missed out. And that wasn't not around like exclusion, but to drive desire. So by taking the approach of understanding, is this culturally right first, meant that we would go tastemakers, early adopters down into general market, which then meant we would get the return from a revenue perspective in time. And that, was a whole seed, ignite, scale mentality. And my job was to kind of understand the best way to do that with a consumer that doesn't like to be sold to. They dig their heels in. And more so now than ever before, there's more consumers doing it, but they sniff out as soon as you push. As soon as they see right through marketing. And so we kind of went through this process where if the tastemakers, those trendsetters kind of adopted what we were doing, a new silhouette or so forth that we want to introduce into the market, we knew that the next step was what we would call an early adopter. So early adopters don't set trends, but they pick up on them really quickly. And we knew that once we got it past the early adopters, then it had the legs to really drive revenue in our marketplace once we moved it through into being more accessible to the general market.
So for our listeners who don't know Nick Gray, they don't know all this amazing work that you've been doing, would you explain yourself as, like, obviously not an agency, you're not a consultant, but you're basically this like brand therapist, this coach that comes in. Sometimes you're even like essentially a fractional CMO, right? IGU Global basically comes in and says like, who the hell are you if you've lost your way? Like you could be a massive brand like Nike, Westfield, and you're essentially like re-anchoring them. Is that correct? For our listeners who are just hearing about this for the first time, how do you explain what you are and who needs you?
Yeah. So like a fractional CMO, we do play in that role, but in time, right? So fundamentally, a CMO kind of comes in and makes an existing system work really well, whether it's for growth, optimization, so forth. What we do is we step maybe one step higher than that. We're better than them. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm not. I'm just kidding. What we do first is we kind of make sure that we are clear in order to make the best decisions for that system. And the bottom line is that, humans make decisions with emotion first. Trust is built on emotion. And so if we are not really clear around the emotional default of a brand or business first, then it can influence depending on the decisions that you're making, right? So, we've begun these sort of premises.
Is that hard for you to position yourself though? Because if you think about it, is like brand, and I'm picking up on this in everything you're saying, is that brand is every decision you make, from how you show up, color-wise, logo-wise, all the stuff that we kind of come to immediately, versus what products you stock, versus what physical locations, where you open those physical locations. Everything is saying something about who you are and who you're for, to drive that desire. So is it hard for you then to be lumped into a marketing category when it's essentially every
Yeah.
decision you're making?
Yeah. So we will play in that space. And like, to cut a long story short, we work with anyone, but we have to have clarity on whether the mindset is right in the first place, right? So if you are there just focused on a fundamental CMO objective, then we're probably not the right business for you. But what we tend to focus on first, and it happens in different ways. A lot of businesses approach me when they're pinballing, right? So when they're like, oh my God, maybe we need to add this category, or is our social media doing the same thing it needs to do in retail? And they're creating all this cognitive dissonance, which is confusing the consumer across their ecosystem, right? Or what we would traditionally call an omni-channel. And so what we always find ourselves doing is going this way first to get that clarity, right? And the reason that that's so important is, you'll hear me talk about this a lot, is there's kind of two camps in retail. You're either a cognitive default or you're an emotional default. A cognitive default is simply when a customer is making an automatic decision, right? Where do I go for my shopping? Coles. Where do I get my home tech product from? JB Hi-Fi. And it's a really short equation in people's heads, and a really hard camp to be in and stay in. But if you're not in that camp, then you're in the emotional default. And what that means is that a consumer is making a buying decision based on a feeling or emotion attached to that brand or business. And so the problem is that if we're not clear on that, double down on that, and anchor to that, what that actually ends up doing is confusing consumers. And that's what impacts doubt, puts doubt. And you've done it yourself.
Yeah.
You've gone to a website or into a store and you've gone, is this the right store for me? I'm not quite sure, And as soon as there's doubt in your mind, then what that does is impact trust, no different to a relationship. And it's very hard to repair.
What Nick is describing isn't a brand philosophy exercise. It's the mechanism behind why some brands grow without pushing and others push harder and harder for diminishing returns. Here are 3 things worth taking back into your business from this conversation. Number 1, know your emotional default before you execute anything. Nick makes a distinction that I think cuts through a lot of confusion about what brand actually means in an e-commerce context. He talks about 2 types of brands: cognitive defaults and emotional defaults. A cognitive default is when a customer makes an automatic, almost unconscious choice. Where do I get my groceries? Coles. Where do I buy my home tech? JB Hi-Fi. It's a short equation in people's heads, and it's a very hard position to earn and maintain. An emotional default is very different. It's when a customer makes a buying decision based on a feeling attached to your brand. And the problem that most e-commerce brands have is that they're trying to compete as cognitive defaults on convenience, price, speed, without ever establishing the emotional layer that makes people actually care. The exercise that Nick uses to find that emotional layer is very much worth stealing. Ask yourself, if your brand were a car, what car would it be? If it were a sports personality, who would it be? It sounds almost too simple, but what it forces you to do is identify the emotional personality your brand needs to be consistent around everywhere. And consistency, as we know, is what builds brand trust. Inconsistency creates doubt. And once a customer doubts whether your brand is right for them, that's a very, very hard thing to repair. Lesson 2, you can't invent an emotion. You can only amplify one that already exists. This was the insight that Mike Halligan from Scratch Pet Food pulled out of an intensive study of the copyright classic breakthrough advertising. And it reframes the whole job of emotional marketing. Most brands approach it from the inside out. And here's what we want people to feel about us. Here's the story we want to tell. Here's the emotion that we're trying to create. And then they brief an agency and they wonder why it doesn't land. The more useful starting point is from the outside in. What do your customers already feel? What emotional state are they in before they even encounter your brand? What are they worried about, excited by, proud of? Your job isn't to introduce a new emotion. It's to find the one that's already there and show up in a way that resonates with it. And the practical version of this is probably simpler than most people think. Go into your reviews, go into your post-purchase surveys, look at the actual language your customers use to describe their experience, not the language your marketing team uses to describe your product. Those words are your brief because they're already emotionally true in a way that anything written from scratch, pun intended, probably isn't. Number 3, emotional investment at the top of the funnel does the conversion work at the bottom. Here's where this gets really interesting for anyone who lives by conversion metrics. Nick worked with a brand that made a deliberate decision to stop pulling conversion levers and instead focus on loading the top of the funnel with emotionally strong storytelling. No extra discounts, no new gift with purchase mechanic, just a sustained investment in making people feel something before they were even anywhere near a buying decision. The outcome was triple-digit growth within 12 months. Of course, it's a big spin and you don't always expect that result. However, there is a data point from a different direction that I think is worth mentioning here. Jeremy Meltzer from I=Change shared a campaign that By Charlotte ran for International Day of the Girl. Instead of a discount, the brand doubled its charitable donation from $1 to $2. That EDM drove a 33% lift in conversions compared to their standard product and promotional emails. No price incentive, just emotional alignment between what the brand stood for and what the customer wanted to feel about spending their money. 33% from an email with no discount, just emotion and connection. So the thing worth asking yourself is, where in your funnel are you actually trying to create emotion? If the honest answer is mostly at the point of purchase through urgency mechanics and social proof, you're probably working harder than you need to at the bottom while leaving a lot of potential desire untouched right up at the top of the funnel. Now, Nick's framework isn't complicated, but it does require a different kind of discipline to what most e-commerce teams spend their time on. It means doing work that's harder to measure and harder to justify with managers and in weekly performance reviews, because it could take longer and it's not as tangible. But the brands that invest in it early end up in a position where conversion almost takes care of itself in a magical kind of way, because the customer already decided before they hit that product page. They'd already made their decision. Features get your brand considered, emotion gets it chosen. If you want to go deeper on this topic, whether that's figuring out your emotional default or building the kind of brand narrative that does the heavy lifting before the sale, jump into the Add to Cart community. There are hundreds of e-commerce professionals in there every day working through exactly these questions. You can join for free over on addtocart.com.au. That's the playbook for this week. I'll see you Friday. Did you know that retailers who are offering fast delivery outperformed their competitors by 4% during Black Friday? And that's not just a stat, that's a signal for where growth is going to come from. ShipIt's Commerce Delivery Report breaks down why speed equals success, as well as the other forces shaping delivery in 2026. From automation and AI to fulfillment and inventory, this report offers a really practical roadmap for the next phase of retail growth. If you want all the stats and the directions for what is coming in fulfillment, make sure you download this report at shipit.com/CDR 2026. That's shipit.com/CDR 2026.